Hello everyone and welcome to American Civil War and UK history. Remember, this is we're on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram, and you will find all the links below in the description. Today I'm in the beautiful Kent countryside and I'm here in Richborough. So Richborough Roman Fort. I would like to thank English Heritage for giving me permission to do this, and obviously Serena for organising this, the site manager. And you know, so she helped organise this. So to tell us the story of Richborough is English Heritage volunteer Jenny. So please step in, Jenny.
Good morning and welcome to Richborough. I'm going to start by asking you to cast your mind back in time 2,000 years, because that's where this story starts. Okay, 2,000 years ago this was an island, and for people unfamiliar with the local geography, it's not an island now. We're standing here in the east, the extreme east of Kent, with the island of Thanet over there to our left, which is now all land just with a river that runs between us. 2,000 years ago this was an island. Point number two, before I start talking about Richborough in detail, is that 2,000 years ago there were already people living here. We know there was a fairly large Iron Age community in residence here on the site, and indeed this part of East Kent has had a human habitation for a long time going back in history. So the Romans weren't the first people to step foot here. I suppose another thing to say immediately about Richborough is come back and see us again in 10 years time, or see this video again, because we're constantly learning about the site. Where I'm standing now is in the three remaining walls of the shore fort itself, which I'll come back to explain more about, but the actual site is 10 times bigger than this. We're standing in 1/10 of the site, and behind the camera here, as far as the eye can see down to the amphitheatre, is where most of the site actually was. So we're constantly learning. Okay, so the summer of AD 43, the first thing I want you to do is forget the three walls, or the walls that you can see in the background, because they weren't here. They were in fact one of the last things the Romans did when they were here. So in the summer of AD 43, we know a proportion of the Claudian forces landed here. And if I ask Darren just to move the camera slightly to the left, the Roman harbour was to my left over here, and we know that a proportion of the army, if you can see this little map it would be really helpful, sailed up what was then the Augustines Channel, dropped anchor and came ashore. And as they came ashore, they came into a community of people who were already what we refer to loosely as Romanised. There was a contemporary writer who wrote within 50 years of the Claudian invasion, who actually stated that no blood was shed. That's not to say blood wasn't shed during the Roman invasion, because we all know it was. But here locally, we believe the local community living here were already very friendly, very familiar. They were trading with the Romans across the English Channel many years before the Claudian invasion. So they landed on site here. They marched over to the first set of ditches. And the story of Richborough, as I always say in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, is the story of three sets of ditches and a large Triumphal Arch. The first ditches that were dug right across the island, which was probably about half a mile wide. We call them now the Claudian ditches. They were a straight line right across this island. So the kind of behind them was the Roman Empire. This was the frontier, probably only for a matter of days or weeks. And then in front of those ditches was the rest of Britannia to be conquered. They quickly got filled in, and very quickly this site became a large supply, logistics, trading camp. Marching camp is another term that's used. Very, very quickly, as the Romans marched inland, they took their infrastructure with them. This site continued to develop. It actually grew very, very quickly. And within a very short period of time, it became a large, thriving town, not just a military base. And at the height of its occupation, judging by the site of our amphitheatre and the size of the amphitheatre, we believe the population may have grown to as big as between 4,000 and 6,000 people at a point in time. So that's the story of ditches number one and this large, thriving town. Then in AD 85, as the Romans got to Hadrian's Wall, and a lot of the infrastructure was being built in mainland England. They built themselves a very large Triumphal Arch, and I believe we're going to move down there in a minute and have a look at it. But I've got a picture for now, right in the middle of the site, which we'll take you to in a minute.
Amazing.
It was a celebration. It was triumph. It was we came, we saw, we conquered. Sounds a bit corny, but there's an element of truth in that. It was probably much more significant than that in terms of what it meant to the Romans. It was symbolic. It may have had some religious connotations to do with the transition between sea and land. It was definitely the symbolic entrance to Britannia. If you look for a minute at the walls behind, the wall in the distance there is 8 metres tall. This beautiful white Carrara marble triumphal quadriphon was 26 metres tall. It would have been clearly visible from the French coast on a clear day, and indeed there were no trees or anything here at that time. It was a magnificent structure. Its symbolism, it was the only big triumphal arch built in England. Its significance was substantial. It was the entrance to Britannia, if you like, the gateway to Britannia. So that happened at the height of the occupation. And then after that, we've got 2 more stories of ditches, because then the population started to decline. And it actually started to decline all over the kind of periphery of the Roman Empire. We know that it started to, the population of towns in France and Belgium and here all started to decline into the 3rd century. And this may be a retraction of the Roman Empire itself, but also here a reflection of the occupation of mainland Britain. Then came the beginning of trouble, if you like, the beginning of incursions and the threat from coming across the Channel. And we know then at some point in somewhere around 225, somewhere around that time, they felt the need to build themselves a defensive fort. So they took their huge Triumphal Arch over here. They probably stuck some form of watchtower, beacon system on the top and dug themselves the next set of ditches. 2 huge ditches round a big Triumphal Arch actually created a small fortress. I've got a picture of it here. It's an English heritage, which is in the guidebook. It's an image there of the Triumphal Arch with the ditches round it. The rest of the houses and occupation beyond the ditches were left in disarray, and we know that from the archaeological digs that have taken place. And for a short period of time, the Romans then created themselves a small fortress here at Richborough. And then within a very short period of time, again, probably no more than 25 or maybe 50 years, the need for a larger defensive fort. This was happening all over the country. This was happening all along the coastlines. They knocked down their Triumphal Arch. There may have been an act of defiance because the Roman Empire was dysfunctional by this time. There's probably more to the story than the simple version I'm going to give you, but there is more to the story. But actually, in essence, they knocked down their Triumphal Arch and they used a lot of this stone. They melted down the white Carrara marble into lime, and they built themselves a Saxon shore fort. One of probably originally 9 or 10, soon to become 15 or 20 along the English coast, same number along the French and Spanish, French and Belgium and into the Low Countries. So the huge defensive building programme that was undertaken over a large period of time, lots of them very similar to each other, hence the Saxon shore forts, which originally would have had 4 walls, not 3. One of them's dropped into what remained of the Wonstrom Channel or the River Stour, somewhere between the 4th and 7th centuries. So this was completed in probably about 275, possibly slightly later than that, and then the Romans continued to occupy this site until 412, when we know they left England.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
Okay.
So should we go over to the gateway?
Yes.
Let's go.
Okay, we're now standing on the platform of the Triumphal Arch, which was constructed in about AD 85. I think it's fair to say that this site has been the most intriguing all through time Early antiquarians and archaeologists were baffled by what this structure was. We know by Tudor times all that remained was very much what you're looking at today, which is a large rectangular square block of rubble and concrete, what looks like concrete, and on the top the remains of what one of the early antiquarians described as a crucifix shape with grass on the top. And it's hard to imagine really what it was like at its heyday. I'm just going to show you the picture again and just remind you that the wall behind me was 8 metres tall and the Triumphal Arch was 26 metres. We know it was a quadriphon. We know that what happened was the Romans had a harbour out on the Wanstrom Channel, out here to my left. Just as this picture depicts, they came off the harbour, they entered here, they walked through their huge quadraphon, Triumphal Arch, onto Watling Street, which wasn't actually called Watling Street at the time, but that's where we are standing at the beginning of Watling Street, if you like, which goes right the way, obviously from here it goes to Canterbury, Rochester, London, Colchester, Chester, all the way to watch it to the other side of Shrewsbury Shrewsbury. So it was the main artery right across England. It wasn't really known what it was until the 1950s. It was very latterly described for what it is, what we know it is now, by doing very detailed observations of the foundations, which are 10 metres deep below our feet. Through time, some of the early antiquarians and archaeologists dug. They believed there were caverns underneath. They believed all sorts of things. But as I say, it was a massive arch. We know there may well have been some form of bronze statue on the top at some point. Fragments of bronze have been found, and therefore there's an assumption that that was probably one of the emperors through time while it stood. It stood from AD 85 until about 275, so it was only here for a couple of hundred years, and I think by the time it was pulled down, its symbolism had probably faded. And I'm also told that white southern Italian Carrara marble doesn't do well in Kent humidity and rain and snow and things, and that by the time they pulled it down there was a functionality about it. They need the stone, but also it was past its day. It probably looked tatty. Some of the inscriptions were probably worn, and there we go. We are standing on the site of the only large triumphal arch ever built by the Romans on mainland British soil. We're now standing on the site of St Augustine's Chapel. It's not unusual to have a Christian chapel inside a Roman Saxon shore fort, but there is quite a story to St Augustine's Chapel, and I will try as I go along to distinguish between fact and fiction. We honestly don't know what was here during Roman times. We know we do have an early 5th century Christian font on the other side of the Saxon shore fort, but this chapel we know has been here for a very long period of time. The inner wall that I'm standing on here now, more or less, we know is Norman, so 500 years after the Romans left. We know the outer wall it is actually medieval, but actually what was here during the Roman occupation we're really not very sure. We do have a story about the chapel itself, and obviously it's the story of St Augustine on his way to be the first archbishop, introduced Christianity to England, that very familiar story. The story goes, and I have to say probably the legend of St Augustine, when he landed here, there's a cross a couple of miles further into Kent, further down the coast, which actually symbolises the very point where it's believed St Augustine met King Ethelbert on his way across England to Canterbury. But the story also goes that actually St Augustine landed here, and he stepped onto this site, he put his foot in the ground, and he left an imprint of his foot in the clay, I struggle a little bit with clay on a chalk soil, but there you go. And afterwards the site became holy, and for hundreds of years afterwards pilgrims would flock to the site on the anniversary of St. Augustine's death, because the site had healing powers. It's also, some of the very early antiquarians and archaeologists that wrote about the site also said that actually King Ethelbert met St. Augustine here, and that there is some theory that King Ethelbert, and it is a theory, it's yet to be demonstrated, but there is, and several again of the early antiquarians that wrote about Richborough talk about King Ethelbert as having a palace here. And there's others who deny that and say that's really just not true, but there is a legend that King Ethelbert met St. Augustine met King Ethelbert here, and King Ethelbert had a palace. So today we have St. Augustine's Chapel. We know there was a congregation in 1508 because we know the vicar of Ash, when he died, he left in his will a mass book and £20 to repair the window. We believe the chapel succumbed to Henry VIII's disillusionment and the pulling down of monasteries and chapels, because we believe by Tudor times, although there is some evidence that there was a congregation here long after the Tudor period. So, and there are lots of colleagues and people around who are doing further research into St. Augustine's Chapel, but it's an interesting site. Okay. You can't come to a Saxon shore fort without having a good look at the walls. I'm hoping Darren's going to be able to capture, as I walk along, if we just slowly walk along the back of the north wall. I forgot to say earlier on the story of 3 lots of ditches. Behind us, of course, is two very, very deep ditches that were dug round the Saxon shore fort when they built the bigger one. Here's a cuckoo. Okay, I don't know whether Darren's going to be able to catch this, but whether you can see along this wall, 8 metres, it would have had a 2-metre rampart, wooden rampart, so the garrison could move along. But if you look down the wall, I think you could, hopefully you'll be able to catch the point where one building party stops and another building party starts. The wall just very subtly looks different. The stone is a mixture of local stone, local rag stone, stone from northern France, cairn stone, ironstone, these terracotta clay tiles, a very typical feature of a Roman wall. And the holes are put logs, they are to do with scaffolding. That's a great one for children actually, to ask them what the holes are for. And here on the north wall we can see a small amount of the original facing. This is the most well preserved bit of wall in the whole site, I think. Okay, we're going to carry on down here and I'm going to show you another quirky feature of Richborough. Lovely example of the put logs here, you might want to use that. That's it. Right, now we're going to go down here. Okay. Are you still filming? Okay. You can't come to Richborough without meeting Queen Bertha. If you look up at the wall, there is a section of stone which, if you're very careful and observant, you can see is slightly different. We call her Queen Bertha's head. I am reliably informed it's actually not a human head. It was, before being very badly eroded, actually the head of a lion. But this is the story of Queen Bertha. Queen Bertha was the wife of King Ethelbert. And the story goes that actually Queen Bertha came here, and through time there is a story, a legend of a large woman's head being carved or being placed, a piece of stone being placed into the north wall of Richborough Saxon Shore Fort, which represented Queen Bertha. And this story travels through time, certainly even as far back as I've been, which is back to Tudor times. Queen Bertha's head is very much alive and well as in terms of the story of Richborough. And today we continue that story. We still have Queen Bertha's head. And I'm not, whether it's fact or fiction, it's certainly one of the little interesting quirks about visiting Richborough.
And one you wouldn't notice if you didn't have an expert with you.
No,
So thank you.
No,
Brilliant.
you could possibly miss her.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. I wouldn't have noticed that. About it, no,
I would love to see this gate called Maiden's Gate. There was an antiquarian through time who called it Maiden's Gate. While we're standing here, there was an interesting observation by a chap called William Boys. He was a local man to Sandwich, and he excavated here during his lifetime. He excavated here in the 1760s, 1780s, about that time. And he excavated what he thought was a Roman lighthouse, or certainly a harbour entrance, over where those trees are there. So we're sort of north-east, standing almost on the north, well, we're in the middle, but towards the northeast of the site. He wrote very clear notes, and as was not unusual at the time, he sold all the stone once he'd found his harbour entrance. He dismantled it, he made very accurate records, and then he sold it. So the stone, and sadly we don't know, but we think very little of it still remains. And that was one of the interesting things on reading about the stories of some of the people who've excavated here over the years, that it was not considered in any way inappropriate to move articles or to store them in your house or to sell them to somebody else. So there we go, just another snippet of information about Richborough.
Yeah.
Standing on the site of an early 5th century font, we know that there was a structure of some sort around the font when it was originally constructed. Bush Fox, who was an archaeologist who excavated here between the world wars, he did a lot of work on this site, and we know it was probably wood, but there was some form of church or chapel or building on this site, which we need to further investigate maybe in the future. But this is the 5th century font. We're now standing inside the Mancio, the principal building, one of the few buildings at Richborough that was here for the whole of the occupation. It changed shape and size throughout, probably started off being a wooden structure, but certainly by the time we got to the later period it was 2-storey, it had a courtyard, and it was made of stone rather than, wood. And in it was a small bathhouse. I'm standing here in the hottest room of all. We believe that the furnace and the stoking area for the furnace was here, and that behind Darren and the camera there was probably the hottest area of all. We're obviously at basement level here. Very little of it remained. We're all at basement level, but these rooms would have been a sequence. You can see the hydrocourse, the course underneath where the heat would have and water. But these rooms would have been very hot, changing room, cold plunge pool. Would have been part of the Mancio, the principal building, which was only where local dignitaries, presumably the people in charge, important people passing through would have stayed. And somewhere on this site, remember what I said when we first came on, that what we're looking at here is 1/10 of the whole site. Somewhere out there, maybe under our cars on the way towards the amphitheatre, is a larger bathhouse. Just going back to what I said earlier on about what we believe to be the size of the population that lived here for a period of time, they would have had another bathhouse somewhere, presumably, and that has never been found because, well, apart from inside this shore fort and very limited excavation to the west and to the north, not a lot's been, and we know there's a lot underground that we know very little about. We're now standing on Watling Street. And if I can just get Darren to pan the camera over there to the east, that rather convenient chimney in the distance there, that's probably the Roman harbour was nearer than that, but that would have been somewhere about its location. So the entrance to Britannia, the gateway to Britannia, the Roman army landed, the big triumphal tower, they came across, and then they came onto Watling Street. Watling Street ran from here, through this bit here, on the way over the bridge. Next stopped Canterbury, Rochester. We know there's a here where the beautiful buttercups are this morning. They're very unusual apparently. The boss tells me this morning she's not seen buttercups here before in this quantity, but that is a 1st century shop. So you can almost imagine 1st, 2nd century shop, that Watling Street was a busy highway, a busy road, and here was a shop that had a canopy at the front and the actual accommodation where the shopkeeper lived in the back. So this site here would have been a busy high street, if you like.
Okay, and I'll leave us with this beautiful walk over the bridge to finish the video.
Okay, so just before we finish up here, Jenny's had to go off now because it's 10 o'clock and the gates have opened. So Jenny's gone off to do what she does best. So I'm going to finish the video here with the wall in the background. So just to finish up here today, I'd like to once again thank Serena, the site manager, as well as English Heritage, and of course Jenny. And a quick plug for English Heritage, it's well worth joining. Over 400 sites as a member you get to visit in England. That also includes Stonehenge, one of the most famous, and obviously I will put the website link down below. I am actually an English Heritage member. It's really worth it. It really is. It's worth the money. If history is your thing, the thing is, these places and English Heritage on their own have had a hard time over COVID. So it's very important that we support all of these causes. Without our help and without the public's help and without joining societies like English Heritage, these places can't continue to operate. It's very, very important that go and join. Get off your sofa, get out the door and come and visit Richborough in Kent. Like I said, all the links below. Thank you for joining us today. See you again soon and goodbye.